Okay, so in this lecture, we will discuss about the endocrine system and development. So hormones are chemical messengers. So when we talk about the endocrine system and the endocrine glands, of course we need to talk about it's inevitable to talk about hormones. So the endocrine glands and several other hormone secreting glands and tissues together all form the endocrine system. So we call it endocrine because these glands, the endocrine glands, secrete hormones directly into the bloodstream. So endo means inside. So you have these glands do not have their own ducts. Actually, that's the most telling difference between the other glands, the exocrine glands. So they have the exocrine glands have ducts, whereas endocrine do not. So the release of the hormones or the secretions of these endocrine glands is directly to the bloodstream. So they are, of course, connected by the cardiovascular system and are also tied directly to the nervous system as the one that oversees the overall regulation and function of the endocrine glands. Now, some organs and tissues also secrete hormones, but they are not considered as glands, such as the kidney, the stomach, the liver, the skin, ovaries, or testes. You have the heart and the small intestines. But of course, each of these organs also have their own overarching functions, and they are not considered as glands. So organs and tissues communicate with cells using hormones as the chemical messenger. So what are hormones? Hormones, simply put, they are chemical messengers. So as messengers, they have the cells that the hormones act upon are their target cells. So one hormone can have many different target cells, and a particular hormone can have widely varying effects on different tissues. So for example, let's say your insulin hormone, the hormone insulin lowers blood pressure, blood sugar level. So its effect on muscle cells or the tissues, the muscle cells, it activates or rather not exactly activates, it induces the transfer of for the muscles. It induces the migration of the GLUT receptors to the surface of cells. So that allows, long story short, it allows the muscles to absorb sugar from the bloodstream. So the insulin also has its effect on the liver. So for the case of the liver, it enhances, or rather it allows, or it tells the liver to store more sugar as glycogen, and also to limit the sugar level of the blood. So the overall effect is lowering the blood sugar level, but depending on the tissues they act upon, they have a different way to do that. So those are hormones. So for each cell of the body, or rather each type of tissue, can have different effects for a single hormone. So that is the hormone. So it's a chemical messenger. So this is the composition of the endocrine system. So we have the hypothalamus, the main regulator, and then the pituitary gland, which is called the master gland, because it is the one that releases the different hormones that directly acts upon the other endocrine glands. So you have the thyroid stimulating hormones and the adrenal the hormones that stimulate the adrenal glands, ACTH. We have antidiuretic hormones. We have oxytocin for uterine contraction. You have FSH and LH luteinizing hormones. This is for the sperm or egg development. You have prolactin for milk production and the growth hormone. So the pituitary gland releases many different types of hormones that acts on the body as well as other endocrine glands. And then you have the thyroid gland for metabolic rate development, and it also regulates growth and development for us, as well as calcium levels. We have the thymus, specially noted for the production of the T cells, part of the immune system. So this is where the T cells are matured. And then we have the heart. It also produces a hormone. And the stomach the kidneys. So these are the different organs that are also part of other organ system, but they are considered has a part in endocrine system because they have their own. They also secrete hormones. So you have what else? You have the parathyroid gland, the pineal gland for the sleep. We call it the circadian rhythm. So sleep-wake cycle. You have your parathyroid gland for calcium level as well. Adrenal glands for different solute levels. This is above the kidneys. So you have control of solute and water levels. You have the pancreas for the blood glucose regulation. And then small intestine as well. And then you have the sex hormones from the sex organs, the uterus, the ovary, and the testes. So, going back, let's look at hormones. So, hormones get to almost every cell of the body because, of course, they are carried by mostly carried by the bloodstream. So, they are chemically active compounds that are produced in one area of the body but have their effect elsewhere. So, for example, insulin. Insulin is produced in the pancreas, which is in your abdomen. And then, its action is mostly seen, well, actually, it's mostly throughout the whole body. And special mention on the muscles. So, they are responsible for the many sequential changes of growth and maturation. They are also agents of response when homeostasis is disrupted. So, a review of homeostasis from last week. So, you have homeostasis, which is the maintaining balance in the body. So, specifically, hormones maintain fluid balance, they control calcium and glucose levels in the blood, they assist in tissue repair, they maintain basal metabolic rate, and assist in digesting food. So there are two main classes of hormones. So we have steroid hormones, which are lipid soluble. So they are basically, when you say lipid soluble, it's fat soluble. So they are hydrophobic hormones. So they can pass directly through the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membranes. Examples of these are the testosterone and estrogen. And then we also have the non-lipid soluble or non-steroid hormones. They cannot pass through the cell membrane, and of course, they require special receptors on the surface of the cell. So the main difference between these classes is, of course, solubility. As I said, we have, if you remember, diba, water and oil do not mix. So basically, the different hormones that are produced are divided based on which solvent can dissolve them. So for lipid soluble, they are oil soluble, or they dissolve in fats and oils, whereas the non-steroid hormones, they are dissolved in aqueous solution, so they are water soluble. And because of this difference in solubility, they have different modes of actions in the cell. So let's look first at steroid hormones. So if you remember from the biomolecules lecture, these are they are hormones that have a steroid or rather their structure is very similar to actually cholesterol. So you have the sterol rings as the basis of their structure. So the long story short, they are oil soluble. And they, because they are oil soluble or lipid soluble, they can pass directly through the membranes, both through the cell membrane, and the nuclear membrane. So if you remember the parts of the cell, you have the cell membrane as the outer covering, and then inside you have the nuclear membrane, which houses or separates the DNA from the outside of or from the interior of the cell. Now, what about these steroid hormones that passes through the bilayer? This is because the cell membrane is made up of what you call the lipid bilayer. So this is your lipid bilayer. And you have, if you look at this one, if you remember the biomolecules lecture, so you have these legs of the bilayer. So it's two layers of basically two layers of your phospholipid layer. So here is the inside of the lipid bilayer. This part is lipid soluble. This is oily. So this is hydrophobic part. And this one, the heads, the circular heads of your lipid bilayer is basically the one that interacts with the aqueous solution. So the inside and the outside of your cell is aquatic. So that means these heads are hydrophilic and the tails are hydrophobic. So inside this part is a hydrophobic system. So the thing about the lipid-soluble hormones is that because they are hydrophobic, they can pass through this hydrophobic layer. Non-steroid hormones, aqueous solutions, such as, for example, glucose, they cannot bypass this bilayer because the hydrophobic part in the middle here rather prevents them from entering. But if you are a lipid-soluble hormone, since you are hydrophobic, so you can easily go through this, go through the bilayer. Whereas if you're non-steroid hormones, you will be rejected by these hydrophobic tails in this bilayer. So basically, that's how lipid-soluble hormones can bypass or easily pass through your membranes. So because they can easily pass through, their actions are more direct, or especially acting on the expression of genes in your DNA. So they can easily diffuse across the phospholipid bilayer. So after crossing the membrane, the steroid hormones can reach and bind to their specific receptors in the cytoplasm or in the nucleoplasm. So depending on what type of steroid hormones it is, so they have their own specific receptor, and the receptor can be either on the cell interior or inside the nucleus itself, because again the lipid bilayer of the nuclear membrane, because the nuclear membrane is also a lipid bilayer, so again it's a bilayer, so it can easily pass through as well. So this receptor hormone complexes, once for example you have your the sex hormones are usually the steroid hormones. So once they bypass inside your cell membrane, so it diffuses into the cell and binds to the receptor in the cytoplasm or in the nucleoplasm. So they bind to the receptor, they form a receptor complex. So it usually, the usual action for steroid hormones is to initiate transcription of genes. So if you remember gene expression, transcription is usually the first stage in gene expression. So you transcribe genes into mRNA, and then the mRNA is translated into its into a new protein. So this is the protein product, and that induces a change. It's either the change is within the cell, or the change can be as in the body as a whole. So basically, this is these new proteins can alter the activity of the cells. And all of this takes a measurable amount of time because, of course, you need to first activate the gene. You need to transcribe it and to translate it into proteins. So basically, this is the usual mode of action, modus operandi of your steroid hormone. So this is for steroid hormone. So what are the different types of steroid hormones? So we have the androgens and the estrogens. These are the sex hormones produced by the ovaries, the testes, and the adrenal cortex. So they target most of the cells of the body, and the effect is to stimulate the development of the male or female secondary sexual characteristics. And then we have the mineralocorticoids in the adrenal cortex. The target is in the kidneys. So they help increase absorption of sodium and water by the kidneys and accelerate potassium loss. We also have glucocorticoids, again in the adrenal cortex. The target is most of the cell of the body, and it's the effect is to promote liver formation of glucose and glycogen release and amino acids from muscles and other anti-inflammatory effects. And then we also have calcitriol produced by the kidneys, and the action is on the intestinal lining. So it stimulates the calcium and phosphate absorption and inhibits the PTH release. So those are some examples of the steroid hormones. So how about non-steroid hormones? So non-steroid hormones cannot pass through cell and nuclear membranes of their target cells. So because again, the lipid bilayer obstructs their passage because they are hydrophilic. They are not hydrophobic, and the membrane is hydrophobic. So in this case, it applies the like dissolves like. Actually, the same with the steroid hormones. We have similar solubility. They mix well together. If they are different solubility, they do not mix well together. So for non-steroid, they have a different solubility than the bilayer. So you have, of course, they are rejected by the bilayer. They cannot pass through. So non-steroid hormones are water-soluble and cannot diffuse across the phospholipid bilayer. So how do they overcome this obstacle for them to actually work on their target cells? So non-steroid hormones have their own specific receptors at the surfaces of the target cells. So of course they use those receptors, they bind to these receptors. So these receptors have an inactive molecule attached to their cytoplasmic side, and it actually, the long story short, this receptor binding initiates a cascade of reaction, usually through the cyclic AMP, or we call it a CAMP. So it's a messenger, a secondary messenger within the cell. So once the hormone binds to the receptor, it initiates a cascade. So when I say a cascade of reaction, we have several protein receptors triggering the activation of other protein complexes and receptors, and so on and so forth. So basically, it's a not exactly a waterfall, but it's a chain reaction of activation. And you have it usually involves again the cyclic AMP, which activates an enzyme inside the cell, which ultimately alters activity. So unlike the steroid hormones, which usually takes time, the non-steroid hormones affect the target cell quickly because they affect proteins that are already present in those cells. So this is the mode of action for your steroid hormones. So when you have your non-steroid hormones, these are water-soluble hormones. They cannot enter the cell. So unlike the steroid hormones that directly enters the cell, the non-steroid hormones, they are usually not usually, they bind to the receptor, and then this receptor has an arm or a part of its parts of its body inside the cell, which is usually a G protein. So this activates adenylyl cyclase. So let's keep it simple. So this activates the protein that alters the level of cyclic AMP, which is the secondary messenger. So this secondary messenger will then pass on the message to other proteins and enzymes. So we call these enzymes protein kinases, because the usual action is phosphorylation. Anyway, these are activation of those other proteins. So this is a simplified version, but usually it usually takes 5 chain reactions. Well, 5 or more chain reactions. So actually do initiate a response to the cell. So just like the steroid hormones, they alter cellular activities, but for the non-steroid hormones, the mode of action is not through activation of a gene, but usually activating proteins that are already inside the cell. So they are usually faster. But non-steroid hormones are not limited to activation of just proteins. So ultimately, some of the steroid hormones can activate genes as well. But again, the mode of action is by activating proteins that are already inside the cell. So basically, that is the action of your non-steroid hormone. So the take-home message is that for steroid hormones, they act on the cell by diffusing, going through or passing through the plasma membrane to the actual inside of the cell, whereas the non-steroid hormones, they activate receptors on the surface that triggers cascades of reaction through different protein receptors as well, and then alter the activity of the cell. So those are one of the main, or some of the main differences of the different the steroid and the non-steroid hormones. So we have in terms of number, there are many types of non-steroid hormones. So actually, I'll just leave it to you to read on your own. Actually, we will be discussing some of them a while ago. So these are the different non-steroid hormones. So a lot of the hormones of the endocrine glands are non-steroid hormones. So we will discuss in the next video. We'll discuss about the tight control on the hormones.